Okay, let's begin by singing the middle border or the middle states.
In the middle of the United States, in the middle of the United States, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Kansas and Nebraska, Wyoming, South Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, and Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois. In the middle of the United States, in the middle of the United States, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Kansas and Nebraska, Wyoming, South Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, and Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois. In the middle of the United States, in the middle of the United States.
Okay, so history class today is we're learning about Abraham Lincoln. You may remember some facts about Lincoln and his early life from Living History Threads 2-1. What are some of those facts that you remember, especially about his early life? And you can pause the video and see how many of those you can say. Today's story is in this book here, Abe Lincoln Goes to Washington. It's about his life as President of the United States. It starts in 1837, and it begins in Springfield, Illinois, which is right here on the map. Okay, so hopefully you can see most of these pictures here. So yeah, pay special attention to all of these paintings and pictures in here. They're really, some really interesting stuff. By the way, Abe Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall. On an April evening in 1837, a tall, lanky fellow swung down from his mud-spattered horse. He'd come 18 miles along the Sangamon River from the village of New Salem to the town of Springfield, Illinois. The young man was a representative in the state legislature, where he had worked to make Springfield the new state capital. He was a new lawyer, too, and he had the papers to prove it, tucked in his tall stovepipe hat. All of his books and clothes were stuffed in his saddlebags. When he had carried them up the narrow wooden stairs to a room of the general store, 28-year-old Abraham Lincoln was settled in his new hometown, there to seek his fortune. When folks got in legal trouble with land or money, murder or romance, they might come to the law office Abe shared with his partner, John T. Stewart. Abe practiced politics, too, and folks came to hear his speeches. His was a fast-growing county that needed good roads and canals, Abe argued, and strong laws. There was a spirit of violence in the land where a man like Elijah Lovejoy of Alton, Illinois, could be killed and to get his printing press thrown into the Mississippi River just because he had Yankee anti-slavery opinions. Depend on it, Abe said, if people can do such things and get away with it, this government cannot last. Writing, talking politics, and visiting folks as he traveled between county courthouses, young Abe Lincoln was making a name for himself. One December night in 1839, Abe slicked down his hair, shined his shoes, and went to a ball. There he was introduced to Miss Mary Todd from Lexington. Abe felt miserably shy and gangly as he bowed to the pretty Kentucky lady. She smiled gaily as she fluttered her fan and asked, "Do you dance, Mr. Lincoln?" As they whirled about the polished floor, Mary talked with Abe about books and politics. They soon forgot about his clumsy feet, and so they began courting. They argued and broke up, made up, broke up, and were finally married on November 4th, 1842. Abe had these words engraved in Mary's ring, "Love is eternal." By 1844, Abe and Mary were able to buy a house. It sat at the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets. Lawyer Lincoln was getting to be known as a man whose ambitions and ideas were extending beyond Illinois. In 1846, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. The Lincolns left their quiet corner in Springfield. They took their children, 4-year-old Robert, and baby Edward on trains, steamboats, and carriages to Washington, D.C. After only one term, Abe and his family came back home to Illinois. He felt like a failure in politics. He and his political party, the Whigs, hadn't agreed with President Polk's popular Mexican War that had won western land, such as California, for the United States. Abe took up lawyering again. In 1850, the Lincoln's younger son Edward died, and a new baby was born. Abe and Mary named him William. In 1853, their last child was born. Abe called baby Thomas Tad. Abe liked to take his two little boys with him to his law office. Tad and Willie made paper hats, spilled the ink bottles, and stuck pencils in the spittoons. The neighbors smiled out the windows to see long-legged Abe walking home with a bratty boy under each arm. In Abe Lincoln's America, there was a monster. It was known as the slavery question. In the South, it was legal to buy and sell black people as slaves. Would slavery be allowed in the new states and territories in the West? That's where thousands of folks were going, shoving the Indians out of the way to get open land and California gold. More and more Northerners were saying, no, they didn't want slavery to spread. Some wanted slavery to end. The slavery question was about the rights of black human beings. Were they entitled to the rights and protections in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution? Or were they just property, like a farmer's oxen? There were other conflicts too. People in the North and South had different lifestyles and businesses. They also wanted different things from government. The monster was tearing the country apart. People were fighting mad and shooting and knifing each other along the border between Missouri and the Kansas Territory. Would Kansas be slave or free? The flames of burning homes and barns lit up the night sky. War clouds were gathering. So on this map here, you'll see all these pink states are slave states. The yellow ones are free states. I actually noticed California is actually a state as well. Remember why? Yep, if you said that it was because of the gold rush, that is why California became a state, because there's so many people there. Notice some of the territories out here. These aren't states yet. They're just territories. They don't have enough people in them to become a state. Like New Mexico Territory. Here's Indian Territory. Kansas Territory. Here's just an unorganized territory. This whole section here is Nebraska Territory. Utah Territory. Here's the Oregon Territory and Washington Territory. So that's interesting how those are made up. And there's quite a few more states there now than what there were territories. The terrible questions facing this country pulled Abe back into politics. A house divided against itself cannot stand, said Abe. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other. Because of his speeches against the spread of slavery, the new Republican Party made him its candidate in the 1858 race for the U.S. Senate. The Democrat opposing Abe was a short, barrel-chested Illinois Senator, Stephen A. Douglas. Noisy crowds came to hear the little giant debate the tall sucker in 7 Illinois towns. Let each state mind its own business, Douglas thundered. Abe stretched out his long, bony arm to the thousands and declared in his high-pitched voice that black people were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Slavery was the eternal struggle between these two principles, the common right of humanity and the divine right of kings. It is the same spirit that says, you work and toil and earn bread, and I'll eat it. He lost the election to the Senate, but still, Mary insisted that her husband would be president one day. She had faith in him, but Abe laughed. Just think of a sucker as me being president. He laughed and slapped his bony knees, but he didn't fool Mary. Abe made lots of speeches around the country and visited his eldest son, Robert, at school in New England. The argument about slavery grew hotter, so loud and fierce that southern states were talking about breaking away from the Union and making their own country. That would mean war, that's what. A civil war of Americans against Americans. By November 6, 1860, enough Americans thought Abraham Lincoln was moderate enough to make him president of a country that was falling apart. Mary, he exclaimed, we're elected! With the news that a Republican president had been elected, southern states began to leave the Union. The government of the United States couldn't just let them go without a fight. The country was facing the unthinkable, war with itself. Hundreds of Lincoln's friends and neighbors stood at the Springfield Railroad Depot on the cold and dismal morning of February 11, 1861. From the back of the train, Abe looked out at a sea of faces and black umbrellas. His long fingers stroked the new beard that framed his sad face as he said goodbye. By the way, Abe got a letter from an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell. She suggested that he should let his whiskers grow, and so he did that. My friends, to this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. This is what Lincoln is saying as he leaves Springfield. Here I have lived a quarter of a century, and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being, who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. Bells clanging, wheels grinding, the train to Washington chugged and whistled out of the station and disappeared in the gray mist and smoke. So long, Abe. 2 days before Abe left Springfield on the train, Jefferson Davis, who had been a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, was elected President of the new Confederacy. On March 4, 1861, on his inauguration day, President Lincoln told the South, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is a momentous issue of civil war. We must not be enemies." So all these states withdrew from the Union, or seceded is what we say. They pulled away and became their own country. Jefferson Davis was the man that was elected president of that new country. As soon as the Lincolns moved into the White House, 10-year-old Willie and 7-year-old Tad Lincoln explored their new home. The White House mice and rats skittered away from them in the cave-like basement and the dark corners of the attic. The hallways and stairs were full of men spitting tobacco juice and waiting to ask Abe for a government job. Robert Lincoln was a student at Harvard College. His little brothers studied at home with a tutor. As they rode their ponies in the grounds south of the White House, Willie and Tad watched out for kidnappers and Southern spies. They played with Union soldiers who were camping in the East Room in case the White House was attacked. Soldiers filled the dusty streets outside, too. Up on the roof, Tad and Willie squinted through their spyglasses, watching for rebel soldiers from the South. In the dark, before dawn, on April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons fired at U.S. Fort Sumter off the coast of South Carolina. The smoldering Civil War exploded into flames. President Lincoln called 75,000 militia into active duty. Fort Sumter is here in South Carolina, just down below Charleston. The first battle of the war happened just 25 miles from Washington, at Manassas, Virginia, on a July Sunday afternoon. Again, Manassas is just above Richmond, so I think right here is Washington, D.C., so it was only 25 miles away from Washington, D.C., it's not very far. People piled into carriages with parasols and picnic baskets to go see the Billy Yanks lick the Johnny Rebs. What they saw instead was the South's victory at the nasty, hot, bloody, smoky Battle of Bull Run. Cannon thunder shook the ground, gunfire and battle cries. People heard a shivers-up-your-back hollering wail, the rebel yell. Men and horses were screaming. Union soldiers and panicked picnickers limped and scrambled back to Washington. Abe listened to the reports. It was going to be a long, long war. Nobody could have really predicted how long the Civil War was going to be, or the terrible amount of casualties, but it's very unfortunate how much there was. Abe ordered Union ships to blockade Confederate ports and spent money to expand the army without waiting for Congress to say it was okay. He had Southern sympathizers thrown into jail. He made 35-year-old George McClellan the commanding general of his army. Here's McClellan. People said McClellan was a military genius, and Little Mac, as he was known, agreed. The president was determined to put down the rebellion and save the Union no matter what. Outside the White House, the weather grew cold and gray as 1861 came to an end. General McClellan drilled his Union soldiers in the mud. Inside, Tad and Willie were sick. Tad got better, but Willie grew worse and worse until he died. Abe looked down at Willie's pale, still face and cried. He said softly, "It is hard, hard, hard to have him die." Mary Lincoln wept and tried to talk to Willie's ghost late at night after night while Abe worked on, his sadness for his boy and for all the boys, hurt and dying in battle, all mixed together. Abe studied books about the art of war and military strategy. He studied varnished paper maps that lined the walls of his office, and even visited the battlefields and hospitals. The Civil War had spread from the Atlantic Ocean to beyond the Mississippi River. Abe grew frustrated with General McClellan, who was painfully slow to attack, then let Confederate armies and victories get away. The general privately called the president a well-meaning baboon. So, spend a little bit of time on this page here. General Robert E. Lee was probably the most dignified, respected officer in the U.S. Army, but he chose to leave the U.S. Army and join Virginia and fighting the South. He was kind of the general of the whole Southern Army, and General Robert McClellan was the general of the Northern Army to begin with. He got changed out later. Obviously, Manassas was the Battle of Bull Run was the first battle in the Civil War. The bloodiest day of the war says 23,250 men were hurt or killed. It's terrible. Shiloh, they say, was the first great battle of the Civil War. Remember again, here's Fort Sumter. That's where the war began. If you can see these blue battles, those are Union victories. The red ones, like here and here, are Confederate victories. The North needed to win the war, or the nation of 1776 would be lost forever. The North needed a new strategy. The President knew that European nations might side with the South for business reasons, but they would never get involved in a war about slavery. Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. When the President wrote that slaves in the rebellious part of the country are, and henceforward shall be, free, the Civil War became more than a war to save the Union. It became a war for freedom. Now, as they had been longing to do, black Americans were allowed to fight as U.S. soldiers and sailors. The Emancipation Proclamation led to the freeing of the slaves, with the 13th Amendment in December 1865. So, interesting enough, Lincoln freed the slaves of the Emancipation Proclamation. However, the slaves in the South they considered themselves part of a different country, they didn't even recognize the proclamations. The slaves in the South were still slaves until the Union soldiers freed them, or they could escape, and a lot of times they would escape from the South and fight in the war in the North. Abe replaced proud General McClellan again and again with Generals Burnside, Hooker, and Meade, always looking for a man who would fight and win. Out in the West, General Ulysses S. Grant was puffing cigars and closing in on Vicksburg, the rebel fortress on the Mississippi. He captured it at last on the 4th of July, 1863. Now the Union controlled the great river to the sea. Folks read about it in the inky newspapers, and about General George Gordon Meade's fierce Union victory at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. They looked for the names of their soldiers' sons and brothers, families and sweethearts. Were they safe? Were they alive? So, the battle of Vicksburg was right here. So this is the Mississippi River coming down through here. That gives you an idea of, by controlling Vicksburg, they can control the entire Mississippi River. And the Battle of Gettysburg was up here in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure that it shows it, but it would have been up in here. That was one of the worst battles in the Civil War, and it was kind of the turning point for the Civil War, where it began going a little better for the North and not so well for the South. An army of 90,000 Union soldiers faced 75,000 soldiers of the South for 3 hot days in the bloodiest battle of the war. Even when all the young men's grandbabies were on the ground, people would still talk about the brave and terrible fighting at Gettysburg. More than 50,000 men were hurt, missing, or killed. Robert E. Lee's defeated forces headed across the Potomac River back into Virginia. Abe slapped his big hand on his desk with frustration. Union General Meade had not chased the retreating rebel soldiers and licked them once and for all. "We had them within our grasp," said the grim, tired president. The war might have ended, but now it would go on. Here you go. Here's where Gettysburg would have been. Here's Vicksburg. This is the city on the bluffs controlled the Mississippi River for the Confederacy. As far south as Port Hudson, Louisiana, General Grant captured Vicksburg after a 7-week siege on July 4th, 1863. Gettysburg Address. In the autumn of 1863, the President was asked to say a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a soldiers' cemetery on the Gettysburg battlefield. Abe and plenty of others thought that his 3-minute speech was a wet blanket. It took a while for people to appreciate the Gettysburg Address. So, there was a man that his name was Edward Everett, who was a very good speaker. He delivered a 2-hour speech before Lincoln's address. About 15,000 people were there. Lincoln carefully wrote this speech. Some people say he wrote it on the last minute on the train, but he actually spent a lot of time with this speech. It was very short. It only lasted for about 3 minutes compared to 2 hours. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And by the way, this is his Gettysburg Address. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We are met to dedicate a portion of it as the final resting place of those who have given their lives that that nation might live. Those who have given It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living or dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our power to add or to detract. The war will very little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work that they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Ulysses S. Grant was the Union's top general now, in March of 1864. Thousands and thousands of soldiers died as Grant and his men pushed on against General Robert E. Lee and his troops. When would the fighting end? And how in the world could a president get re-elected in the middle of a civil war that everybody was sick of? Sometimes, Abe said, I'm the tiredest man on earth. When the votes were counted in 1864, Abe won his second term in office. The Democrat he defeated was his former commanding general, George McClellan. At his second inauguration, March 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln said these words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. That's kind of ironic. Lincoln said that he didn't have malice toward anybody and charity towards everybody, but he seems to have wanted peace and healing for both sides, but he was also determined to fight until his side won. 1864 to 1865, the Civil War comes to an end. The Union soldiers captured the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia, on April 3rd, 1865. The very next day, Abe and Tad went there on a small boat. Wrecked ships and dead horses floated in the water. Black people came to greet the president as he walked through the burnt city. Pale faces watched from the windows. Abe sat for a moment at Jefferson Davis's desk. "What about these conquered people?" the president was asked. "Let 'em up easy," Abe sighed. Back home in the White House, Abe had a dream. He saw a coffin draped in black, sitting in the great East Room. "Who is dead in the White House?" Abe demanded of one of the soldiers guarding the corpse. "The president," was his answer. "He was killed by an assassin." Abe slept no more that night. General Lee surrendered his gallant, tattered army to General Grant on April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over at last. More than 2,300,000 men had fought in the many battles. Now, soldiers were marching home. In front of the White House, a band was playing. Crowds of people were yelling and throwing hundreds of hats high into the air. Abe went out to greet them all. Mischievous Tad waved a captured battle flag from the Confederacy from the White House window. When Abe saw it, his tired face crinkled into a smile. "Play Dixie," Abe said to the band. "It's one of the best tunes I've ever heard." Dixie was a South song. It was one that the Confederate had decided that it was going to be their national anthem, and it was oftentimes the rebel soldiers played that song. Friday evening, 5 days later, Abe took Mary to see a funny play at Ford's Theater. "We must both be more cheerful," said Abe. "Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable." That night, an actor who was full of whiskey and anger about the way the war had turned out sneaked into the booth where the Lincolns and their guests were sitting. John Wilkes Booth shot his small pistol, leaped from the box onto the stage, then ran to the back of the theater and into the night. He escaped on a galloping horse, for a time. "No! Oh no! The president's been shot!" The theater was full of screaming. "Mr. Lincoln's been shot!" Abe was carried across the street to a little room in a boarding house. That was where he died the next morning, April 15, 1865. His body was carried back to the White House to lay in state in the East Room. Soldiers stood watch as 25,000 people slowly walked past Abe's black-draped coffin. So just a little bit of background on John Wilkes Booth. He was actually a very highly successful actor, but he was angry about the South's defeat because he thought slavery was good for the country. And so he felt like he was doing the right thing by taking out Lincoln. He was angry about how that had turned out. Never before had an American president been murdered. In the aftermath of the shooting, John Wilkes Booth was killed, and those who plotted with him to kill the president were hanged or put in prison. Vice President Andrew Johnson became the 17th president, as the 16th had become a legend. The tall, skinny poor boy, the frontier tree chopper, the flatboat man with only a year of proper school, the village shopkeeper, and country lawyer became Father Abraham, the Emancipator, the president who had saved the Union. A funeral train carried Abe Lincoln back to Springfield, Illinois. All along the way, people paid their respects with poems and flowers. In between the towns and cities, people stood along the tracks, listening for the lonesome whistle of the funeral train. They stood by silently as President Lincoln's train passed by. So long, Abe. And that is the end of that book. Kind of a sad ending, but at the same time, I believe Lincoln did what he thought was best for the country. Alright, so list 5 facts that you remember about this story. And so you can pause the video and see how many you can list. If you want to list more than that, that's great. And so here are some of the most important ones. What does the term secede mean? It means to withdraw, like Southern states withdrew from the United States. And a couple facts about the Civil War. It lasted from 1861 to 1865. It was the deadliest war in American history. Some facts about Abraham Lincoln. He was President of the United States during the Civil War. He was famous for the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation. And he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And again, there are more than that. If you listen to some more, that's great. Anyways, that is all for history class. We'll see you next time.